The rain had started before dawn, a slow, relentless drizzle that slicked the cypress roots and turned the bayou paths into black glass. Even from the road, the Lancaster estate stood like something out of an old cautionary tale. Its shutters hanging loose, paint blistered away, the upper windows shuttered so long they might have forgotten how to open. Dr. Samuel Whitford had been there only twice before, but the place left an impression that clung, a kind of heaviness in the air as though grief had soaked into the walls. He was not a man prone to superstition, but he had read the coroner's reports, generation after generation of children dead before 13. Drowning, fever, a fall from a second-story balcony, even a lightning strike. Coincidence, the locals said, until you listened closely to the ones who lowered their voices, the ones who spoke of the widow in the swamp and the promise she dragged into the afterlife. Today, Eleanor Lancaster was waiting for him on the veranda, her eyes bright but strained, as if she'd trained herself to hold back the storm inside. "It's about my son," she said without preamble. "He's 12, 13 in 7 months. You know the rest." The words trembled, not from fear, but from defiance, as if naming it was an act of rebellion. Whitford had seen many forms of grief, some raw, some ossified into silence. But this was something stranger, a woman suspended between terror and calculation. In his notes later, he would write, "She does not ask whether the curse is real. She only asks how to break it." This suggests belief so deep it is no longer a question. Inside, the house smelled faintly of camphor and old paper. Eleanor led him to the library, where the family's past was not just remembered, but catalogued. Row upon row of journals, ledgers, brittle letters tied in black ribbon. She opened one without hesitation. The ink had bled in places, the handwriting cramped and slanted. "These are from my great-grandfather. He wrote about a woman named Sabine Duval. Said she cursed him with her dying breath." She tapped the page with a fingertip. "He stole her land. She swore no Lancaster heir would live past 13 until it was returned in blood." Whitford studied the page. The language was matter-of-fact, almost cold. No fevered ravings, no embellishment. He had seen enough fabricated tales to know this was different. "Why show me this?" he asked. "Because I think I've found a way to end it," Eleanor said, lowering her voice. "And I need a witness, someone who will believe what they see." He hesitated, aware that crossing this line meant more than indulging a superstition. It meant entangling himself in whatever she believed awaited her in the swamp. Still, something in her gaze, sharp, unyielding, made him think refusal would not protect him. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the smell of rain and rot. Somewhere in the distance, a branch snapped. Eleanor glanced toward the sound but didn't flinch. 7 months, she murmured. "That's all the time I have left to bargain." Whitford felt the words settle over him like a damp cloth, heavy and suffocating. He had not yet decided if he believed in curses, but he knew this much. Something was already moving toward them, slow but certain, like the tide creeping in under a moonless sky. And when Eleanor looked at him again, he saw no doubt in her expression, only the steady, unnerving certainty of someone who had already chosen the moment of her own end. The sound returned that night, long after Whitford had left the estate. It came in the form of low, uneven knocks against the back door, a rhythm that wasn't wind or rain. Eleanor heard it while sitting at the kitchen table, staring at the unlit lamp. She didn't move at first. She counted the beats. 5, pause, 3, pause, 2. It was the same sequence her father had claimed to hear the night before her brother drowned in the bayou. Matthew slept upstairs, his breathing faint but steady, a comfort she measured by its regularity. She had told herself she would not burden him with the truth. Not yet. But the house seemed to know otherwise, whispering it through the thin walls, carrying it in the cold draft that crept under the doors. By morning, the knocking had stopped, replaced by a silence so complete, it felt staged. Whitford returned, drawn by a sense that his work as an observer had already crossed into something more personal. He found Eleanor in the library again, this time bent over a different journal, the leather cracked and blackened at the edges. "This one belonged to my grandfather," she said without looking up. "He tried to outrun it, took my uncle north when he was 9. They made it as far as Illinois." She turned the book to show him a page. The handwriting was hurried, the lines uneven, the ink blotched. Saw her in the window. Sabine. Same as the day she died. No older, no less furious. Whitford studied the words and noted something strange in the margins. Sketches of a tree with a twisted trunk and bare branches. "Have you seen this tree?" he asked. "In the bayou, past the marsh, near the old altar," Eleanor said, as if reciting a location she'd memorized since childhood. "Every Lancaster who's gone looking for it, they didn't come back." The weight of her certainty pressed on him. In his own fieldwork, he had encountered cases where trauma knitted itself so tightly into a family's narrative that it became indistinguishable from reality. Yet here, the pattern of deaths, the witness accounts, the exact repetition of events, it did not fit the shape of delusion. The mid-morning light filtered weakly through the library windows, catching on the dust that hung in the air like suspended ash. Whitford felt the urge to leave, to put miles between himself and the suffocating certainty of this house. But Eleanor's voice anchored him. "I'm going to the altar before his birthday. If I can find her there, I can make the offer." "What offer?" he asked, though the answer seemed obvious. "My life for his." The way she said it, without hesitation, made him pause. He realized she had rehearsed it, perhaps for years, a vow formed long before Matthew was born. Whitford closed the journal gently, aware that any protest might be useless. "If you go, you shouldn't go alone," he said, hearing his own voice betray the decision he didn't know he'd made, to follow her into whatever waited in that swamp. A sudden gust rattled the shutters, and both of them looked toward the sound. Outside, the sky had darkened unnaturally fast for midday. The cypress trees swayed, though no wind touched the grass near the porch. And in that shifting half-light, Whitford thought he saw movement along the far tree line, something tall and motionless at once, as if the swamp itself had taken shape to watch them. He did not mention it to Eleanor at first. To name it felt dangerous, as though saying the words would solidify whatever he had glimpsed into something more present, more deliberate. Instead, he made an excuse to walk the perimeter of the property, boots sinking into the sodden ground, eyes scanning the cypress shadows where shapes could be born and vanish in the same breath. The tree line remained still, the air unnervingly stagnant, but Whitford could not shake the sensation of being measured. Years in the field had taught him that observation was never neutral. Either you were the watcher, or you were the subject. Here, he suspected he had already been classified as the latter. Eleanor was waiting for him in the parlor when he returned, a small leather satchel at her feet. "We'll need to go at dusk," she said, as if the decision had already been agreed upon. "That's when the altar is active. My grandfather wrote about it. Torches lighting themselves, the water stilling, no insects. You'll see it." Her certainty was unnerving. In his notes, scribbled quickly before she noticed, Whitford wrote, "Her belief is absolute. I must determine whether this conviction is self-constructed or externally sustained." The distinction mattered less to him now than it had before arriving. Whatever the source, the outcome seemed poised to be the same. By late afternoon, the rain returned, a heavier downpour that blurred the outlines of the swamp beyond. Matthew appeared in the doorway, pale and thin, his hair sticking to his forehead. "Mama," he said, "I heard it again last night. The knocking." His voice was matter-of-fact, like a child reporting a broken window, but Eleanor's knuckles whitened around the arm of her chair. Whitford noted the boy's composure. If fear was present, it was buried beneath resignation, an awareness beyond his years. "How many knocks?" Whitford asked gently. "5, then 3, then 2, Matthew answered without hesitation. "Same as in the stories." He looked toward his mother. "It means she's close, doesn't it?" Eleanor rose abruptly, ending the conversation with a tight smile. "Go upstairs, Matthew. We're leaving soon and you need rest." The boy obeyed, but not before glancing back at Whitford, a silent exchange of understanding neither fully recognized yet. As the sky darkened, they prepared lanterns and ropes, as if the swamp required not only courage, but a form of permission to enter. Whitford felt the weight of his own choice pressing in. This was no longer detached study. He was about to step into the heart of the narrative where objectivity would dissolve. The path into the bayou was narrow, flanked by water on both sides, the surface reflecting a sky the color of old iron. Somewhere far off, a heron called, its cry stretched and distorted until it sounded almost human. Whitford kept close behind Eleanor, the beam of her lantern cutting thin slices of light into the dark. When they reached the first bend, the air changed, thicker, heavier, as though they had crossed into a pocket of time where nothing aged and nothing left. Whitford's skin prickled, and in the stillness, he became aware of a faint glow ahead. It pulsed faintly, not like fire, but like breath. Eleanor slowed, eyes fixed on it. "That's the altar," she whispered, "but it's not supposed to be awake until nightfall." From the shadows beyond the glow, something shifted. Too tall for a person, too fluid for an animal, and Whitford realized with a jolt that it was standing between them and the only path back. For a moment, neither of them moved. The lantern light quivered in Eleanor's hand, casting thin, fractured beams that only deepened the shadows around the figure. Whitford's mind worked furiously, not with the logic of escape, but with the clinical reflex to observe, to capture every detail, every angle, as though understanding it might give him leverage. The shape was wrong for a man, too elongated in the limbs, yet it stood upright. It didn't advance. It simply existed in the space, as immovable as the altar itself. In his field notes, Whitford would later write, "The sensation was not of being threatened, but of being appraised. There is a difference." Eleanor took a step forward, slow and deliberate. "Sabine," she said, her voice soft but carrying, "I've come to speak of the dead." The figure tilted slightly, as though the name had weight. A wind rose from nowhere, curling through the reeds, carrying the scent of damp earth and something metallic. Whitford's instincts screamed at him to pull her back, to find another way, but Eleanor's resolve was carved into her posture. He tried to measure the distance between them and the figure, 8 paces, maybe 9, but the path's edge fell away into black water on both sides. Retreat would mean stepping into the bayou, where the ground was uncertain and the roots beneath could twist like hands. The glow from the altar intensified, revealing more of the figure, a dress that seemed woven from shadow, a face both veiled and visible in the same instant. Whitford felt the dissonance in his mind, the impossibility of holding two conflicting images, and yet here they were, coexisting. "Tell me what you want," Eleanor said. Her voice no longer trembled. "Tell me how to end it." A low sound drifted from the figure, too deep to be speech, too intentional to be wind. Whitford recognized it as a cadence, the rise and fall of language, but it was older than anything he knew. Eleanor listened without flinching, and when it stopped, she nodded slowly. "What did it say?" he asked. "That the debt can't be erased," she replied, eyes fixed on the figure. "Only transferred." The implication struck him with the clarity of cold water. Transfer meant exchange. Exchange meant sacrifice. He searched her face for hesitation, for any flicker of doubt, but found none. The figure shifted, and in that movement, the path behind them was suddenly clear, as if it had never been blocked. But Whitford understood this was no act of mercy. It was an invitation to choose. Leave now and abandon whatever Eleanor intended, or step forward and witness what no living Lancaster had survived. Eleanor glanced at him. "You can still go," she said quietly. "No one will think less of you." But Whitford knew she was wrong. He would think less of himself, and the thought was unbearable. The figure moved again, gliding toward the altar. The glow spread outward, illuminating the twisted trunk of the tree from Eleanor's grandfather's drawings. Its bark shimmered faintly, and Whitford realized it was wet. Not from rain, but from something darker, something that carried the smell of iron. Eleanor followed, her lantern bobbing in the darkness. Whitford took a breath and stepped after her, feeling the path narrow until it was barely wider than his own shoulders. Somewhere behind them, the water rippled as if something unseen had slipped beneath the surface, pacing their steps. Whitford turned his head slightly, the lantern's glow just grazing the black water. It reflected nothing but the faint outline of cypress knees jutting like bone from the swamp floor. The ripples continued, deliberate and measured, too steady to be the work of wind. He thought of the stories he had read, the accounts of something that followed those marked by the curse. Never attacking, never rushing, only keeping pace until the appointed hour. Eleanor did not look back. Her focus was fixed ahead, on the twisted tree and the altar beneath it. The air around them had thickened to the point where each breath felt like drawing in wet cloth. Whitford could feel his pulse in his throat, the instinctive recognition that they had entered a place where the rules of the living held no sway. The altar itself was a rough slab of stone, half swallowed by the earth, with strange etchings carved deep into its surface. Some resembled letters, others shapes too abstract to place. Moss and lichen clung to the edges, but the carvings were clean, as if kept free by unseen hands. Eleanor approached with reverence. She set the lantern down on the stone, its light pooling in the grooves, casting shifting patterns along the trunk of the cursed tree. "This is where it began," she murmured, almost to herself. "Where my great-grandfather sealed our fate." Whitford's gaze moved between her and the tree. Its bark was slick, and at its base, roots twisted into forms disturbingly like clasped fingers. He crouched, running his eyes over the carvings, noting their symmetry. In his mind, the clinical part of him catalogued every detail, but another, quieter part urged him to step away. The figure, Sabine if Eleanor was right, stood at the opposite side of the altar. In the lantern's light, her outline wavered as though she existed in more than one place at once. Whitford had read about visual distortions under extreme psychological stress, yet here, the effect felt less like his mind failing and more like the world refusing to settle into a single truth. "Do you accept?" Eleanor asked the figure. Her voice did not tremble now. Whitford felt the temperature drop, the air pressing closer. The figure tilted its head. A sound emerged again, low and resonant, wrapping around the space like smoke. This time, Whitford could almost make out syllables. Blood given, name spared. He realized the exact phrasing mattered. The curse wasn't about ending, it was about shifting. The Lancaster line might survive, but at a cost measured in more than one life. Eleanor's hand brushed the surface of the altar. "It will be mine," she said. "Take me." Whitford's breath caught. He understood then that she had invited him not as a witness for the sake of record, but as a safeguard to ensure that what she intended was carried through without interference. Behind them, the ripples in the water grew louder, closer, as though whatever had been pacing them sensed its moment approaching. The figure raised an arm, pointing not at Eleanor, but at Whitford. For an instant, Whitford thought he had misunderstood. The gesture was unmistakable, deliberate, unhurried, the shadowed hand cutting through the air to rest its focus squarely on him. His stomach dropped, a cold weight pulling him toward the black water. Eleanor's head snapped toward him, eyes flashing with something between confusion and alarm. "No," she said sharply, stepping in front of him. "It's me you want." The figure did not move, did not lower its arm. The pointing became an accusation, a declaration, as if the swamp itself had already decided the terms. Whitford's training told him to analyze, to step back into the safety of observation, but here there was no safe distance. He was in the frame now, a subject rather than the recorder. The ripples drew closer until the sound was all around them, a slow, circling pattern that suggested not one presence, but several. Whitford's skin prickled. He could feel the shape of unseen eyes in the dark, pressing against him. "Why him?" Eleanor demanded, her voice rising. She turned toward Whitford, as if the answer might be written on his face. He had no explanation, but in the moment between breaths, he wondered if the curse had shifted long before this night. Perhaps the act of bearing witness was not neutral. Perhaps simply knowing too much had tethered him to the Lancaster debt. The figure's other arm rose, this time gesturing toward the altar. The carvings caught the lantern light in a sudden flare, their lines seeming to pulse with a rhythm that matched the rippling water. Whitford felt a pressure at the base of his skull, an insistent pull urging him forward. Eleanor stepped closer to the figure, voice low but urgent. "If you take him, the line continues. That's not the bargain." The air grew colder still, and for the first time, Whitford thought he saw Sabine's face clearly, eyes like pits of still water, a mouth that did not move yet somehow formed words inside his head. Blood is blood. It was not a refusal, nor an agreement. It was a law, immutable and without sentiment. Eleanor's hand shot out, gripping his arm. "Stay behind me," she whispered. But her voice trembled now, and Whitford could feel the bones of her resolve shifting. The unseen movements in the water ceased. The silence was worse, an expectant stillness that pressed in from all sides. The figure lowered its arms, then took a step backward toward the altar. The space between them seemed to elongate, as though each step forward would take twice the effort it should. Whitford glanced toward the path they'd come from, but the bayou had swallowed it. Only dark water lay in that direction now. Eleanor's grip tightened. "It's choosing," she said. "And if it chooses you..." She didn't finish. She didn't have to. The lantern flickered violently, casting their shadows huge and distorted across the twisted tree. In the warped shapes, Whitford saw something that made his chest tighten. His own shadow standing alone, Eleanor's absent from the image entirely. And in that moment, the figure turned its head toward the water, as if calling something forth from below. The surface broke in a slow, deliberate swell, not like a fish breaching, but like something vast pushing upward from a great depth. Rings spread outward, distorting the reflections of the lantern light until the swamp seemed to writhe. Whitford caught the glint of pale shapes just beneath the surface, too small for full-grown bodies, yet unmistakably human in outline. His first thought was of the Lancaster children, all those whose names he had read in death records, all claimed before their 13th year. Eleanor stiffened, and her breath came out in a shiver. "She's showing us," she said. "Every debt collected." The pale shapes drifted closer, circling in the shallows. Their movement was slow, synchronized, as if bound by the same current or the same will. Whitford forced himself to keep watching, even as the weight of their presence pressed into his chest. The water had no smell, but the air around it carried something like copper and mildew, the scent of years-old dampness sealed inside stone. Sabine stepped aside from the altar, her attention fixed entirely on the figures beneath the surface. The glow that had emanated from the carvings began to seep into the water, spreading in faint tendrils until the pale shapes shone from below like moonlit silhouettes. Whitford's mind raced. Was this a display meant to intimidate, or an invitation to understand the scale of her power? In his notes, scribbled hastily in the margins of his memory, he framed it as both. Control of narrative through fear and proof. She offers history, but only in the form of threat. Eleanor took a step forward, her boots sinking into the mud at the water's edge. "If you take him," she said, voice tight, "you break the bargain. You ruin the meaning of it." Sabine's head tilted, the gesture almost curious. The figures beneath the water stopped circling, aligning themselves in a perfect arc facing the shore. Whitford realized they were waiting, not for Eleanor's words, but for Sabine's signal. The air felt electric now, every breath charged with a hum he could not place. Whitford could feel his own resolve weakening under the pressure. He thought of Matthew in the house, likely asleep, unaware that his fate might already be sealed or altered in the darkness of the bayou. Without warning, Sabine raised her arm again, but this time she pointed to the twisted tree. At its base, the roots seemed to shift, parting just enough to reveal a hollow black space. Something glinted inside, catching the lantern light, a small silver locket, tarnished but intact. Eleanor's hand flew to her mouth. "That's my mother's," she whispered. "She died before I turned 13. The implication was clear. The swamp did not simply claim lives. It kept pieces of them, tokens preserved in its own vault. Whitford's stomach turned. This was no abstract curse. It was a contract with receipts. Sabine stepped toward the hollow, her shadow stretching long across the altar and over the water. The pale shapes beneath the surface began to sink, fading into the dark until the ripples stilled. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the frogs and insects seemed to withhold their voices. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, Sabine placed her hand on the locket and turned her face toward Whitford. Her gaze was weightless and crushing at the same time, like staring into deep water where the light couldn't reach. Whitford felt the air thicken in his lungs, his body urging him to look away, but the force of her attention held him still. In her eyes, there was no anger, no pleading, only recognition, as if she had known him long before this night. Eleanor stepped between them, her voice sharp. "This isn't his date." Sabine's hand tightened on the locket, and for a brief second, Whitford thought he saw her fingers sink into the silver as if it were wax. The surface warped, the image inside, too small to make out, blurring into nothing. He felt a cold ripple run through him, not from the swamp, but from something shifting in the air around his own name. Whitford had always believed curses to be cultural constructs, stories given weight by repetition and belief. Yet now, he sensed something more mechanical, a system with its own rules, indifferent to human notions of fairness. "Blood is blood," she had said. If that was the truth of it, the debt could be reallocated without ceremony. Eleanor reached for the locket, but Sabine's hand withdrew into the hollow. When it emerged again, she held something else, a brittle scrap of parchment, edges blackened as if it had been pulled from fire. She extended it toward Whitford. He didn't want to take it, but some pull beyond willpower made his fingers close around the fragment. The writing was cramped and slanted, the ink faded but legible. Recorded witness, Samuel Whitford. Debt confirmed. His stomach lurched. The implication was undeniable. He was already part of the record. Whether by stepping onto Lancaster land, touching the altar, or simply hearing too much, he had crossed the threshold from observer to participant. Eleanor's face paled as she read over his shoulder. "No," she said, but it came out as breath more than voice. "That's not how it works. It can't just shift like that." Sabine's form began to blur at the edges, as if the night itself was reclaiming her. The glow from the altar dimmed, and the swamp's sounds returned in fragments. Distant insects, the occasional splash in the shallows, the creak of unseen branches. Whitford wanted to speak, to demand clarity, but the words lodged in his throat. He realized Sabine was not answering questions tonight. She was setting terms, and whatever terms she had chosen for him would remain sealed until the moment they were enforced. Eleanor gripped his arm hard enough to hurt. "We need to leave. Now." The path behind them had reappeared, thin and treacherous, but visible. Whitford's lantern was still burning on the altar, yet he did not recall placing it there. Sabine stood beside it, motionless, the locket glinting faintly in her other hand. As they stepped back onto the path, the water stirred again, not in pursuit, but in a slow, retreating motion, as though the swamp was satisfied, for now. Whitford didn't look back until they reached the bend. When he did, the altar was empty, the lantern gone, and the twisted tree stood alone under the weight of the dark. But just before the path curved out of sight, he thought he saw the faint outline of the locket swinging from one of its branches. It moved without wind, a slow pendulum arc that made no sound. Whitford could not decide whether it was meant to be a warning or a mark of possession. He felt the same sensation he had at the altar, a quiet, deliberate claiming. Eleanor didn't look. Her eyes were fixed ahead, her jaw set tight, as though seeing it might lock her feet to the ground. By the time they reached the veranda of the Lancaster estate, the storm had begun in earnest. Rain slanted across the porch, hitting the shutters in bursts that sounded like impatient fists. Whitford followed Eleanor inside, but the house felt different now. Its silence was no longer the absence of sound, but the presence of something unseen, listening. Matthew stood in the hallway, pale but dry, his nightshirt slightly rumpled. "You went to her," he said simply. It was not a question. Eleanor knelt before him, cupping his face. "You're safe," she said, but the words were hollow. Whitford caught the faintest tremor in her hands. She was too careful not to glance toward him, and that avoidance said more than words could. In his own mind, Whitford was cataloguing every shift, the way Matthew's eyes lingered on him a fraction too long, the faint tightening in Eleanor's posture when they were in the same room. Something had passed between the swamp and the house, an invisible thread tethering all three of them to what had happened. Later, in the library, Whitford found himself staring at the old family journals again. He flipped through them not as an investigator now, but as someone scanning for his own name in an obituary. Every recorded heir had an entry, their birth, their death, and the signs that preceded it. At the end of one ledger, in a different hand, he found a note. Witnesses are not exempt. The storm deepened, wind howling against the eaves. Eleanor entered quietly, setting down a tray with untouched tea. "She chose you," she said, not unkindly. "I don't know why, but I saw it happen." Whitford's instinct was to deny it, to hold on to the role of observer, but the parchment in his pocket, the one declaring debt confirmed, felt heavier with each passing minute. "If that's true," he said, "then Matthew, he's safe as long as you're not." Her voice cracked, but she didn't look away. "That's the trade." Lightning flashed through the windows, bleaching the room white for an instant. In that moment, Whitford thought he saw a figure at the far end of the hallway, a tall, unmoving shadow with the curve of a locket at its throat. But when the darkness returned, the hall was empty. Eleanor reached for one of the journals, flipping to a page covered in her own handwriting. "If you're part of this now," she said, "then you need to know there's more. She doesn't just take. She uses." Before he could ask, a sharp knocking echoed through the house. 5, pause, 3, pause, 2. It came from the back door, the same rhythm Eleanor had counted in the kitchen days before. They both froze, and from the hallway, Matthew's voice drifted toward them, soft and almost curious. "It's for him this time, isn't it?" The words seemed to travel farther than they should have, as if the house itself carried them into every corner. Whitford turned his head slowly toward the boy. Matthew was leaning against the doorframe, his expression untroubled, almost serene, as though he had been expecting this moment for longer than Whitford had even been in Louisiana. Eleanor rose, moving quickly to place herself between them. "Go upstairs, Matthew," she said, her voice steady but tight. "Stay in your room and don't open the door." Matthew's gaze lingered on Whitford, a flicker of something older than his years passing behind his eyes. Then he obeyed, footsteps retreating up the staircase without a sound. The knocking came again. 5. Pause. 3. Pause. 2. This time it seemed to reverberate through the floorboards, as if the house itself was hollow and the sound was coming from inside its bones. Eleanor glanced at Whitford, and for the first time he saw hesitation in her. "If you open it," she said, "you're accepting whatever comes through." Whitford swallowed hard. "And if I don't? Then it comes another way." She crossed to the window, peering into the rain-streaked dark. "You can't hide from it, Samuel. None of us ever could." He moved toward the back door, lantern in hand. His pulse hammered against his ribs, but there was a strange clarity in it, the recognition that running would only postpone what had already begun. The handle was cold under his fingers, colder than the night air. He hesitated, and in that pause, the knocking stopped. The silence that followed was worse, a pressure building in the absence of sound. Slowly, he pulled the door open. There was nothing on the porch, only rain pooling in the warped wood, the cypress trees swaying far off in the dark. But just beyond the reach of the lantern light, he saw it, a thin silver chain glistening against the wet boards, the locket resting at its end. He bent to pick it up, but before his fingers touched the metal, a voice spoke from the dark. Not loud, but so close it felt as if it came from inside his own chest. "Blood is blood." Whitford's hand froze. The chain twitched, as though pulled gently from the other end, and he realized something unseen was holding the opposite loop. Eleanor was suddenly behind him, her hand gripping his shoulder. "Don't take it," she hissed. "Once you do, there's no turning back." The chain moved again, the locket swinging toward him in a slow invitation. His rational mind screamed to retreat, but another part of him, a part that had been growing since the altar, was drawn forward, compelled to close the gap. He straightened, stepping back into the house and shutting the door with a firm, final motion. But as the latch clicked, a drop of cold water slid down the back of his neck, and he realized it wasn't rain. When he turned, the locket was lying on the kitchen table. It was perfectly dry, its silver surface gleaming as though it had never been touched by rain. Whitford stared at it, pulse quickening, the rest of the room falling into a strange, muffled silence. He didn't remember walking past the table. He didn't remember opening his hand to place it there. And yet, here it was, waiting. Eleanor stood in the doorway, her face pale but unreadable. "You didn't put that there," she said flatly. It was not a question. Whitford's training told him to keep his voice steady, to avoid confirming what they both already knew. "Then how?" "It means you've been marked," she interrupted. "From here on, it doesn't matter if you accept it. She already has your name." He moved closer, resisting the urge to touch the locket. The closer he leaned, the more he felt it, an almost imperceptible hum, like a heartbeat too faint to hear but strong enough to feel through the bones of his fingers. In his mind, two truths fought for dominance. One, that this was an object no different from any other. Two, that it was the most dangerous thing in the house. His hesitation was not superstition, it was recognition. Eleanor stepped forward and snapped the locket shut with a metallic click. "Leave it here," she said. "Don't wear it. Don't even carry it." "Why not destroy it?" Whitford asked. Her eyes flicked toward the window, where rain traced trembling paths down the glass. "Because it's not really here. Break it and you're breaking something you can't see. That kind of damage spreads." Before he could press her, a faint sound came from upstairs, a slow, deliberate creak of floorboards. Eleanor's head turned sharply toward the ceiling. "Matthew's supposed to be asleep." Whitford felt the shift in the air again, that subtle tightening that meant the house was no longer empty. He reached for the lantern, its circle of light barely pushing back the edges of the darkened hallway. Together, they climbed the stairs. The creaks continued, moving toward Matthew's room, then stopping abruptly. Eleanor pushed the door open without knocking. The bed was empty. The window stood open, rain blowing in over the sill. On the bedspread lay a second locket, identical to the one downstairs. Whitford's chest tightened. Two of them? Eleanor shook her head slowly. No. One. It follows the marked. They searched the upstairs hall, calling Matthew's name, but the house absorbed their voices, swallowing them whole. A sudden chill swept down the corridor, and Whitford caught movement at the far end. A shadow, tall and still, with something glinting at its throat. He stepped forward, but Eleanor grabbed his arm. If you chase it, you won't come back. The shadow tilted its head, and Whitford felt the weight of unseen eyes settling on him. The hum he had felt in the locket now seemed to vibrate in his chest. Then, without a sound, the shadow turned and slipped into the dark, and Matthew's voice floated after it. Calm, almost content. It's all right. She's not here for me anymore. Eleanor froze at the sound of his voice. It was too steady, too certain, lacking even the trace of fear a child should have. Whitford felt an unnatural stillness settle over the hallway, as if the walls were listening. "Matthew," Eleanor called, but her voice was softer now, as though she feared a louder tone might provoke something. From the darkness ahead, Matthew stepped into view. His eyes looked clearer than before, but there was a strange distance in them, as if a part of him stood somewhere else, entirely. The hem of his nightshirt was damp, the fabric clinging to his legs. Whitford's mind latched onto the smallest details, the faint trail of muddy water on the floorboards, the metallic scent rising from it, the way Matthew's bare feet made no sound as he walked toward them. "She spoke to me," Matthew said, stopping just a few feet away. "Said she's made her choice." His gaze shifted to Whitford. "It's you now." Eleanor reached for him, but Matthew stepped back, shaking his head. "You don't have to protect me anymore, Mama. You promised you'd stop the curse, and you did." Whitford heard the words, but beneath them he felt something heavier, a subtext that was not the boy's own. In his notes later, he would write, "Speech cadence altered, possible external influence, responses too rehearsed for spontaneous conversation." Eleanor's face tightened. "She's using you to speak to us," she said. Matthew tilted his head in a way Whitford had seen before, on the figure at the altar. "She doesn't have to use me. I let her." The air seemed to grow colder, the lantern in Whitford's hand flickering once, twice, then dimming. Somewhere behind them, a faint drip echoed in the silence, and Whitford realized it came from downstairs. They descended together, Matthew following without a word. The trail of damp footprints led them back to the kitchen where the first locket still lay on the table. Except now, it was open. Inside was a small scrap of parchment identical to the one Sabine had given Whitford at the altar, his name written in the same cramped, slanted hand, but this time followed by a date. 7 days from now. Eleanor exhaled sharply, gripping the back of a chair. She's counting down. Whitford felt his pulse quicken. He had thought the curse was a looming, shapeless threat, but here was a schedule, a fixed moment when it would arrive. That knowledge did not comfort him. It rooted the fear deeper. Matthew's voice broke the silence. "She says you should come to her before then, at the tree." "Why?" Whitford asked, but the boy only smiled faintly. The lantern light wavered again, shadows bending across the walls in unnatural shapes. One of them stretched long and narrow, bending around the room until it pointed directly toward the back door. Whitford felt Eleanor's hand on his arm. "If you go to her," she whispered, "she'll take you before the 7 days are up." Matthew stepped toward the door, resting his hand on the frame. "She'll take you either way." The boy's tone was not cruel, but there was no trace of comfort in it either. It was the calm announcement of an unavoidable truth, the sort that lands in the pit of the stomach and refuses to leave. Whitford felt the words settle there, heavier than the rain still drumming against the windows. Eleanor moved quickly, pulling Matthew back from the door. "Enough," she said, her voice trembling despite the firmness of her grip. "Go upstairs and stay there." Matthew didn't resist, but he didn't look away from Whitford. His eyes held the same strange clarity as in the hallway earlier, as though some quiet agreement had been reached between himself and the darkness outside. When his footsteps faded up the stairs, Eleanor turned to Whitford. "She's already inside," she said quietly. "The knocks, the footprints, the locket. Those are just the formalities. The rest of it happens here." She tapped 2 fingers against her temple. Whitford had seen possession described clinically in his work. Disassociative states, externalized guilt, survival responses, but here, the distinction between folklore and lived experience was collapsing. He no longer doubted that whatever force Sabine embodied could bend thought as easily as it moved water. "We still have time," Eleanor continued. 7 days is more than the others ever got, but you have to decide. Are you going to wait for her or meet her on your terms? The question echoed in his mind long after they retreated to the library. The fire in the hearth sputtered against the damp air, casting a restless glow across the spines of the old journals. Whitford picked one at random, its leather cover cracked like old skin. Inside, he found entries written not in Eleanor's family's hand, but in a script he recognized instantly from the parchment: Sabine's. The pages were dated decades before her death, chronicling disputes with local landowners, whispers of the bayou's true owners, and something she referred to only as the exchange. One passage made his pulse quicken. "The witness is bound by the seeing. The eyes are the door, the name the key." He closed the journal, suddenly aware that the flickering light in the room was no longer just from the fire. In the far corner, where the shelves met the wall, the shadows had thickened into a shape, tall, narrow, and utterly still. "Eleanor," he said without taking his eyes from it. "Don't look, but we're not alone." "I know," she replied. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "She comes closer when you read about her." The shape didn't move, but Whitford could feel it pressing against the edges of his thoughts, testing for a way in. His fingers itched toward the locket, which he had sworn not to touch, yet he felt certain it was the one thing that could confirm her presence. The fire guttered low, and in the dim, the shape seemed to lean forward. The hum from the locket began again, faint but insistent, syncing with the rhythm of his own heartbeat. And then Matthew's voice drifted down from upstairs, carrying the same calm certainty as before. "She's ready for you now." The words carried a finality that was almost ceremonial, as though he had announced the opening of a door that could never be closed again. Whitford rose slowly, feeling the weight of Eleanor's gaze on him. She didn't speak, but her grip on the arm of her chair was so tight the wood creaked. "Don't go to her," Eleanor said at last. "If she's calling now, it means she's ready to take more than just you." Whitford considered that, his mind turning over the strange logic of the curse. Sabine had always claimed one Lancaster heir before 13. If that heir had been spared, through Eleanor's choice, through Whitford's involvement, then perhaps the debt had compounded. The idea landed in his chest like a stone dropped into water, sending ripples of dread outward. Matthew appeared at the top of the stairs. He looked composed, but his eyes reflected lantern light that wasn't there. "She says it's your turn to come to the altar," he said, "and if you don't, she'll come here." "That's worse." Eleanor moved toward the staircase. "You don't speak for her." "Yes, I do," Matthew replied evenly. "You gave me to her once already, Mama. You just didn't let her keep me." The accusation stung, even to Whitford. Eleanor flinched but said nothing. Whitford felt the pull then, not physical, but a tightening in the air, as though every shadow in the house leaned subtly toward the back door. His thoughts were not his own. They were drifting into patterns that were too measured, too deliberate to belong to him. The locket on the kitchen table clicked open by itself. Inside, the parchment was gone. replaced by something wet and black, glistening faintly. The smell that rose from it was the bayou's own, mud, rot, and the metallic edge of stagnant water. Whitford stepped closer despite himself. In the shifting light, the black mass began to change shape, curling into a form he recognized with sick certainty, the twisted branches of the cursed tree. Eleanor pulled him back. "It's a door," she said urgently. "If you touch it, you won't walk out again." But the hum began, deep and resonant now, filling not just the room but his chest cavity, his bones. Matthew descended the stairs slowly, his bare feet making no sound. "She's waiting," he said. "The path is open. You don't have to be afraid." Whitford wasn't sure if it was courage or surrender that pushed him forward. He picked up the locket, its silver surface burning cold against his palm. The hum sharpened, and the kitchen seemed to fade, walls thinning, shadows stretching until they resembled the narrow bayou trail. Through it, he could see the altar, faintly glowing beneath the twisted tree. Sabine was there, motionless, her eyes fixed on him with a patience that felt older than the swamp itself. Eleanor's voice cut through the haze. "If you go, I'm going too." But Whitford knew this wasn't her summons. It was his. And somewhere deep down, he understood that answering it might not end the curse. It might only change its keeper. He closed his hand around the locket and stepped toward the shadowed path that had opened before him. He closed his hand around the locket and stepped toward the shadowed path that had opened before him. The kitchen was gone in an instant, replaced by the damp breath of the bayou and the soft give of mud underfoot. Lantern light no longer reached him. Instead, the path was lit by the dim, unnatural glow spilling from the altar ahead. The air was thick, and every step felt as if he were moving deeper into something alive, something watching. He didn't look back. Some instinct told him that if he did, the path would seal itself shut, trapping him between places. The hum from the locket guided his pace, matching his heartbeat until the two were indistinguishable. Sabine waited beneath the twisted tree, her form sharper than he had ever seen it. Less mist, more flesh, though her edges still bled into shadow. She said nothing. The bayou itself seemed to fall silent, holding its breath. Whitford stopped at the altar, the locket still clutched in his hand. "You've chosen me," he said. It was not a question. Sabine inclined her head. Her voice, when it came, was not carried by the air but by the water around them, seeping into his bones. "The debt stands. Blood is blood." He thought of Matthew, safe in his bed, or so he hoped. "If I take his place, does it end?" Her eyes deepened, the black of them pulling at his vision. "It never ends. It only moves." A cold understanding settled over him. There was no defeating the curse, no cleansing it. There was only carrying it, becoming its vessel until it passed again. Eleanor had been right from the start. This was not a story of salvation, but of substitution. He opened the locket. Inside, the black mass shifted, resolving into the faint image of his own reflection. The moment his skin brushed it, the world around him bent. The tree's branches curled inward like skeletal hands, and the altar's glow sank into the stone. The hum became a roar inside his skull, then cut off abruptly, leaving only silence. When he blinked, he was standing at the edge of the Lancaster property, dawn breaking pale and cold over the horizon. The locket was gone. In its place, a faint ache pulsed at the base of his throat, where the chain might have rested. Eleanor was on the porch, searching the tree line. When she saw him, relief washed over her face, but only for a moment. Her gaze shifted, and he knew she saw it, the change in his eyes, the thing that was now looking out from behind them. Matthew stepped into the doorway beside her. "It worked," he said, but his voice carried no joy. Whitford felt the weight of the swamp still on him, its pulse threading through his own. Somewhere far off, he thought he heard the familiar rhythm. 5, pause, 3. Pause. 2. Though this time it wasn't knocking. It was his own heartbeat. He turned toward the bayou, the rising light doing nothing to thin the shadows there. The debt was his now, and though he didn't yet know the terms, he understood the truth. The curse had no beginning, no end, only keepers. Somewhere, deep in the water, Sabine would be waiting for the next. The events surrounding the Lancaster curse remain disputed. Some say Whitford disappeared within a year. Others claim he still walks the bayou, searching for the one who will take his place. Whether you believe it or not, one truth is harder to escape. Debts written in blood are never forgiven, only passed on. Do you think Whitford truly sacrificed himself to save Matthew, or did he simply become the curse's willing accomplice? Share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe for more stories where the line between the living and the lost is far thinner than it seems.